I'm Kiara Klein. I am the Director of Producing at the Public Theater, and I am delighted to welcome you to our second collaboration with the Metropolitan Opera this season. And tonight's program, please give yourselves a round of applause. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Antony and Cleopatra, which is sort of a perfect bullseye for us in the new work and Shakespeare department. And you are going to hear from Chukwudi Iwuji, who played Enobarbus in our last production of Antony and Cleopatra, as well as Michael Thurber, who in addition to composing Goddess, which is currently in previews downstairs, he also composed the music for our last production of Antony and Cleopatra. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, our friend of the public and the Metropolitan Opera, Robert Marx, and the composer and conductor of Antony and Cleopatra, John Adams.
Well, I thank all of you for coming on a dark and rainy night. It's great that you're all here. I'm Rob Marx, and welcome you to a joint presentation by the Met Opera and the Public Theater about music and Shakespeare, marking the very exciting New York premiere a week from tonight of John's new opera, Antony and Cleopatra. And we have three quite remarkable people who will be on the panel once we after about 20 minutes, just with John, Michael Thurber and Chukwudi Iwuji, and they'll be coming out. But for now, we have our wonderful composer, John Adams, who not only has composed Antony and Cleopatra, but is conducting the run as well. How he does this, I have absolutely no idea. And since the 1980s, John has been at the very top rank of composers worldwide, really. And has worked in so many different orchestral and vocal and operatic forms. And since the Pulitzer Prizes were announced today, John won the Pulitzer in 2001 for On the Transmigration of Souls, which was the New York Philharmonic's memorial commission for the victims of 9/11. And beyond all those decades of concert work, there are these really extraordinary operas: Nixon in China, Death of Klinghoffer, Dr. Atomic, Girls of the Golden West, all stunningly original compositions. And Antony and Cleopatra is John's fifth work at the Metropolitan, and no other American composer has ever had that kind of place in the Met's repertoire. And given that the company is in their final week of rehearsals, it is extraordinarily generous on John's part to take an hour out of all this and come down to 425 Lafayette Street at the Public Theater. So, John, I thought we'd begin with probably the most obvious point of all, which is to ask, after writing so many operas that have very direct American themes and issues, why did you want to compose a Shakespeare opera, and then why Antony and Cleopatra?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've known the play for a long time, and so if I were going to do a Shakespeare opera, it would have been this. And we can get into what it was that drew me to it. But the previous opera was an opera about the gold rush that my longtime collaborator, Peter Sellers, and I made in 2017. And in the course of research about the gold rush, we discovered that reciting Shakespeare was a very popular pastime amongst in these minors and very, very restricted culturally circumstances. And so it was Peter's idea to incorporate a few passages from Macbeth, and I found that setting Shakespeare just absolutely got my juices flowing. And then I was asked to compose an opera for the 100th anniversary of the San Francisco Opera. And I said, okay, I want to do Antony and Cleopatra.
And you decided to do the libretto yourself, to take the play and edit it and,
I did.
and shape it.
Yeah.
And what brought you to that decision?
Well, I have to say that when it comes to setting texts, I am an absolute snob. And I really cannot stand most of the contemporary libretti that are you know, have been used by my colleague composers. I find them really prosaic and lacking in poetry and lacking in almost everything in terms of the beauty of language and the depth of psychology. And I really felt that after having already composed 5 or 6 operas and several oratorios, that I had done so much tweaking and twisting and massaging of texts anyway to make it work to what I wanted to do musically, that I might as well do that with Shakespeare. I did have help. My wonderful stage director, Elkanah Pulitzer, was very instrumental in helping, sort of taking this huge elephant of a drama. At times, I've actually said Antony and Cleopatra is a mess.
It is.
You know,
yeah.
thank you. And you know, it has something like 50 characters and 30 scenes and 3 continents, and you know, it had to be boiled down. We worked. I think I spent 6 months just working on the libretto. What I really wanted to do was just focus on the 3 characters, which is what we do in opera, you know. And I was really drawn to this story, this couple, because they are not Romeo and Juliet. They are 2 people who have, as people would say here in New York, they've been around the block. Each one has a history. I mean, she had, as a teenager, she had had a real hot and heavy affair with Julius Caesar. And now she's Queen of Egypt, and she's a very, very powerful personality. She's, as Shakespeare sees her, she's got the most extraordinary bandwidth of personal traits. On the one hand, she is a queen, she's an executive, she's very, very concerned about the longevity of her dynasty and of her civilization. She's can do a fabulous, nasty hissy fit, which I had great fun composing. She's paranoid. She's vulnerable. She's proud. And at the end, she accepts her fate in the most kind of lofty, realistic way. So, you know, that's a really exciting person to write music for.
And as you began to shape the libretto, I've always wondered if the sort of the legacy of the 2 really wonderful Alice Goodman libretti written for you it became a kind of model in a way, because the librettos for Nixon in China and Klinghoffer are and I agree with you that in contemporary opera there's a libretto problem, and I think Alice conquered it.
Alice Goodman's 2 libretti. You're right.
Yeah.
I think they're like the best English language libretti in 20th century. I really do.
They are up there with Hofmannsthal and Gertrude Stein and the best of the 20th century. But I'm just wondering how, having had that experience of having those 2 wonderful pieces by Alice. How did, if they did, shape your own thinking about how you wanted to structure
I don't
Cleopatra?
think really it had that much influence. I mean, those were very unique operas. What Alice did in Nixon in China was just so wonderful because she has a sort of perfect pitch for the different kinds of language. You know, when Mao sings, his texts sound like they're straight out of the Red Book. You know, everything is an apophthegm, or you know, it's this or that. And when Nixon as soon as he opens his mouth, he sounds like he's doing a luncheon at the Chamber of Commerce. You know, that was a very different thing. And here I've already got this incredible text. The issue was, how do I, you know, with opera, 10 lines of text that goes by in theater in 10 seconds or 20 seconds. 10 lines of text in opera takes sometimes a minute. So I had to just strip this down. And if you're madly in love with Antony and Cleopatra, you may not be happy with what I've done, because you'll say, well, this is missing and this is missing, and you took out this line, and it's not, you know, it's not rhyming, and you know, you damaged this and that. But we do that in opera because music is really what creates the form, not the words.
And how did that process of cutting and reshaping continue after the world premiere in San Francisco?
Well, you know, it's really funny because when I write a piano concerto or an orchestra piece, nobody ever comes up and asks me about cuts. But I couldn't get out the door after the premiere in San Francisco when I didn't hear people, cuts, when are you going to do cuts? Mm-hmm. It's just, you know, accepted that you know, this is the first thing we have to put up with. I'm not giving you a hard time here, but you're asking about revisions. And, you know, the truth is, even as experienced an opera composer as Verdi, when you're imagining this creation that has music and text and movement and perhaps dance and lights and, you know, scenery, you just can't entirely foresee what's going to happen and how time is going to pass. And usually what happens is that time passes a lot slower than you want it to. So, yeah, cuts.
And was there any recomposition?
I only recomposed one passage that I wasn't happy with, and then I wasn't happy with it the second time we came out, and so you will hear the world premiere of the third version.
Okay.
But it's only a short passage.
I have a question about collaboration, because you've written this opera for two of the most extraordinary opera singers we have today, Gerald Finley and Julia Bullock. They have deep experience with your music. There's a shorthand between the three of you. You all know what you're doing, right? And they know how to approach your scores. So on the musical side, there is this deep experience, but it's a whole new production team. So you sort of have parallel tracks between singers who are embedded in your music and a production team that represents, with Elke Hanna-Pulitzer, a new direction and new voices coming into what you do. How have you balanced those two elements?
Well, I think, you know, once I've finished the composing, I wouldn't say my job is done. Obviously, it's not. But you know, the issue of staging and, you know, how the people move and how do they relate to each other is really in the hands of the stage director. And I really adore watching Elkanah work. She's very quiet. she has a wonderful wry sense of humor, and she invites the singers to sort of suggest things. You know, she's not a dictator, and you know, on the one hand, she's very gentle, but on the other hand, she gives the singers a certain agency, shall we say. And so I think what's developed, like the chemistry between Jerry Finley and Julia is I guess you can't say chemistry is electric, can you? What can I say? It's explosive. And Julia is just the most phenomenal actress. She can do all of those qualities that I listed, and she's just a lot of fun to work with.
You've also spoken on other occasions about how the experience, say for an audience, of Antony and Cleopatra is closer to Debussy's Pelléas than your previous operas, because it's grounded in sung speech and not in arias and ensembles. Could you say a few words?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, most of my other operas had poetry. Alice Goodman, I asked for poetry, so there were these arias, these set pieces, and I'm pleased actually that nowadays, young opera singers in the U.S. and Europe even audition with, Pat's aria from Nixon in China, or "Batter My Heart," the big aria at the end of Act 1 in Dr. Atomic. But first of all, what's interesting about the Shakespeare Antony and Cleopatra is there are no soliloquies. There's no to be or not to be, a big set piece. It's amazingly missing of these things, and it really is almost like a contemporary back and forth, like a TV script. People are bang, 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 and I've never written anything like that. In fact, some of the criticism of my collaborations with Peter was that there wasn't enough dialogue, that people were just standing and singing these beautiful texts, but that this kind of crackle, this electricity between the characters was kind of missing. So when I started composing this, my model was Debussy's Pelléas and Melisande, not musically, because that's really the strange atmospheric Gothic sort of fin de siècle fantasy piece. But what I took from Debussy was that the idea was that he took the Maeterlinck play and he just musicalized it. And I think he called it, his term was musicalized text or something like that. And that's what I've done with Antony and Cleopatra. So a lot of the psychological import is coming from the orchestra, which I learned from Wagner.
So on that note, I'm going to invite our other panelists to come on. Michael Thurber and Chukwudi Iwuji, who should be in the wings there. Well, while they're coming on, I'll just mention, in terms of Pelléas, just in the vagaries of operatic production, Pelléas has these wonderful orchestral interludes, and they're all expanded beyond what Debussy had originally intended,
right,
because they couldn't get the scenery to work.
That's right.
and they had to go back to Debussy and say, write more music. You
Yeah.
have to cover the scene change.
Yeah. I'm always encouraged to think that, we think of the composer as creating this perfect, ideal form when, in fact, in the case of Daphnis and Chloe, wow, we need 5 more minutes.
It's all very practical in the
there.
end.
Yeah.
It's extremely practical.
Yeah. You want me to go get them?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
There they are.
Oh,
All
okay, they're
right.
coming. Here. Okay, here we go. Welcome, welcome. Michael Thurber, like John Adams, is in the midst of a major production downstairs. He has got us in previews for which he's written the music and the lyrics. And he has worked across many arts platforms in New York, including being the bass player on John Baptiste's band, Stay Human. And both Chukwudi and Michael were on this stage for the last production of Antony and Cleopatra done here at the Public Theater in 2013. Chukwudi is an associate artist of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And his roles over there have cut across an amazing range because it extends from Fenton in Merry Wives of Windsor to Claudius and Hamlet and Henry VI. In New York, he was Barbus in Antony and Cleopatra, which was a production shared by the public and the Royal Shakespeare Company. He's done Hamlet here on the Mobile stage and Othello in Central Park at the wonderful Delacorte Theater, soon to reopen. And now, lucky us, he lives in New York. And Michael, I thought we could begin with your saying something about the difference between writing incidental music for a Shakespeare play or the underscoring for it versus a full-out score like John's or an opera or a musical.
Yeah, it's a great question because it is very different. It's a very different approach. For me, the thing with Shakespeare, I've had the pleasure of doing, I think, like 10 Shakespeares here at the Public. And he's a very musical playwright. There's a lot of music literally built into all of his shows, like lyrics for songs. But even just in the language, it's very musical, it's very rhythmic, and the way that he constructs scenes just really lends itself to a sonic vocabulary. So the way that I always approach specifically incidental music or underscoring is just trying to sort of bring out an undertone to a scene that is not telegraphing, but at the same time it adds something, energizes whatever's happening in the scene in a really specific and subtle way. And that's what's so difficult about it, because you don't want to be obvious emotionally with what's happening, because the language does that, but at the same time, if it's too transparent, then it's like, why even have music, so you have to strike this really difficult middle ground where you're trying to find something that just brings out this X factor in whatever the scene is doing, that just elevates it, or sometimes not even that, sometimes just sort of creates an environment for it to happen in and feel a little bit more heightened.
Mm-hmm. I found a quote from John in your program notes for Antony and Cleopatra. Shakespeare, of course, is so inherently musical that the internal rhythms all but suggest their own musical shapes.
Amen.
And Chuck, I thought, that applies to actors as well. You and I have both worked with Peter Hall.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember Peter being unbelievably strict about how actors had to follow a kind of musical notation within Shakespeare's verse.
Yeah, not just, yes, I remember I worked with a great man. It was a production of the Bacchae, actually, but to audition, you had to do Shakespeare. And I remember arriving at the National Theatre, and for my audition, and Peter sat in the desk, and there was the assistant and all that, and he said, "Welcome," and then he proceeded to just sit like this. He wasn't looking at the text. He just wanted to hear it. Mm-hmm. So he sat like this and just listened. And of course, everyone had drilled me, whatever you do, verse structure. Mm-hmm. If it's iambic, ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. Little hold at the end, come back, ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. make sure you find that. And I remember that's all I did. I don't know if I even brought any character to it. You know what I mean? But I just knew I had to hit the verse and that music that was in there intrinsically. And then that's when you start knowing when it goes from iambic to trochaic to whatever. You can sort of hear it just shift. And I remember him just sitting there with his eyes closed. And then afterwards, he looked at me and just said, "Well spoken." And I got the part. You know what I mean? And I feel... with Shakespeare, that's what I try to get to young actors, is that, you know, it's such high stakes, yes, and I mean, no higher stake than seeing it in opera form, but it really is about the shifts and the turns and the... I use this in this audience, musicality. I would be scared to use it with a lot of actors because then they start thinking of being musical. But the musicality is intrinsic in it, you know, in many ways. And that's what can give you... When we sit with a lot of regular other text, we're trying to figure out why this person acts like this, or how do I act like this, or how emotional does it get. But suddenly you have Shakespeare, and then he'll give you ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. Then he might go tum-ti, tum-ti, ti-tum, ti-tum, or just tum-ti. And you're like, what the hell is going on with all this? If you listen to it, you suddenly start knowing what this person is going through right now. It is the cause. It is the cause. My soul, monosyllabic, ti-tum. This guy doesn't want to do what he's about to do. He's trying not to do it. It's in the music. And then you suddenly have, in a Barber's, we were talking about the barge she sat on like a burnished throne, burned in the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so, I mean, it's lyrical. I'm drawing you in if you go with the music, with the structure of the line. I've gone on long and long and long, but that's my answer. You know.
Michael, is there an example that just sort of pops into your head of a Shakespeare text imposing a musical shape on your work?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so many. I don't even know where to begin. I could give you the one. Well, the one that's on my mind right now is I'm writing the music and the songs for Twelfth Night this summer in the park when the Delacorte reopens. And Twelfth Night is a really musical play. I mean, to Chukwudi's point, all of them are, right? But Twelfth Night in particular is such a musical play, and there's a lot of songs in that play. And Feste has a beautiful song at the end of the show. And I've spent a lot of time talking with James Shapiro, who is the resident Shakespeare scholar here at the Public Theater, and just such a brilliant, amazing guy. He's the last person you would expect to be a Shakespeare scholar. You meet him and he just seems like some dude from Brooklyn, which he is. But he's brilliant. And so we've talked for hours about that song and him breaking down each stanza of, you know, what Shakespeare is going for here. And the rhythm of the lyrics is 100% set, you know. And James is actually very radical in some ways because he's sort of like, you don't have to use this song. He's like, I'm just explaining it to you so that you understand what he's going for and what this moment is about. But he's actually usually a very big fan of, you know, you could totally write your own thing. I guess Shakespeare would do that a lot as well. Swap songs in and out. The music would change depending on what musician was playing it. So that's something that I'm actually sort of wrestling with right now is that, you know, if I'm to do a different song in that moment, how do you still sort of honor the rhythm of those lyrics, and how do you honor the sentiment of the lyrics? And to Chuck's point, it's almost like, you know, and these are actor terms, right? But it's almost like he's giving you, in the best way, a line reading all of the time.
Completely.
Because it's like, he tells you exactly what's important and exactly just the way, and to your point, it's like all you really need to do is just stand like 10 toes down and just say the words, and it's going to take care of itself, you know? Mm-hmm. So that's always the challenge with the plays, is that if you are going to try to do your own thing with it, or if it's an adaptation where people want to try something new with it, how do you still sort of find that inherent musicality that's in the rhythm of his language?
Mm-hmm. And then Chuck, as an actor, how do you know your own voice and what its limits are, what it's capable of doing?
Funny story. When I moved from the States, I studied in the States. So the first job I landed in England was with the Royal Shakespeare Company. And I had bought a cassette tape, this is how old I am, of Alex Jennings doing the sonnets. Because in my head, that's supposed to be how it's done. He's considered one of the most beautiful speakers ever. And I went into my first voice lesson with the late, great Cicely Berry. And I said, I've been listening to Alex Jennings. And she grabbed the tape and she threw it against the wall and smashed it. And said, never, ever, excuse my French, but she swore like a sailor, fucking use anyone else's voice. So the answer to that is that I don't know the limits of my voice till I have to try to say something. And often those limits come in Shakespeare with O's, all the O's. I played Othello, and there are more O's in that than the length of the Bible. The words like, think of Leah, howl. There's all these words that, as a performer, you have to let go of what you feel they could sound like, because you will talk yourself into not doing it, because it's so beyond how we feel we express ourselves normally. But you will land into that. You will find yourself in the situation, and all you have, Leah's line carrying his daughter dead, is how do you do that? How do you tap into that? So my answer to you is that I don't know the limits of my voice, and I'm not interested in finding out. What is interesting is when the circumstance and the scene is in front of me, and you play it, what comes out? And it could be anything, you know. That's the best answer I have. I don't know the limits, and it's really fun when your voice surprises you, when it cracks when you don't expect it to, when it becomes something, the famous Hamlet that, oh God, what is his name, where he played his own, he did the same voice for his father possessing him and talking to him, and played Hamlet. Oh God, I'll remember the actor, did Brazil, lead guy in Brazil. Anyway, he actually channeled his father's voice possessing him, and it freaked the whole theater out. And he didn't know he was gonna do that till he did it. So the limits are wherever the text takes you.
And Michael, do you find yourself in writing both musicals and incidental music, that sometimes you're writing for a specific voice that you know, the way John has written Antony and Cleopatra for Jerry Friendly and Julia Bullock?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, has anybody seen John's opera yet? Has anybody seen it?
It opens next week.
Okay. So I had the pleasure of hearing 2 of the songs at the Met a few weeks ago, and they're amazing. I'm a big fan, though, so maybe I'm biased. But and you nailed that. I mean, you wrote for those voices so beautifully. I feel like that's the whole thing. Because otherwise you get into bizarre like formulas, like it becomes so predetermined in like a terrible way, and the music is bad if you're just thinking about things like range. Like, well, this role is an alto and this role is a mezzo, or, you know, so on and so forth. You really have to be able to hear the person's voice in your head, because every singer is so unique, and they all have different sweet spots in their voice, and they all have different sensibilities, and they all have things that they're very good at. That are just inherent gifts, even if they're a wildly trained singer. That's the thing that's so amazing about a voice, right? Is that it's, to a certain extent, no matter how much you train, it's a thing that you were born with, right? And so you hearing that voice in your head when you're writing, I think is maybe the most important thing if you're writing music for voice, because that's how you get out of the way. And it's not about your ideas. It's not about like what you would just do, like generically, just writing for an instrument or something. And you instead start to think about like, well, what would this person do? You know, so like whenever I'm writing, especially with original songs, like in a musical, I'm literally just like, I'll listen to that person. I'll listen to everything that they have online. I'll hang out with them. They'll come over to my studio. We'll play music together. I'll want to know what their favorite music is. And then when I go to write, it's more of just, I guess it sounds so corny, but it's like trying to just channel them like try to have a conversation in your head with them and just sort of close your eyes and try to just play in real time the song that they would sing, you know.
And then does that extend to orchestration and scoring, so that, John, in writing for these voices that you know so well, does that affect the orchestration?
I don't think so. No.
Fair enough, fair enough. Now,
I wish I could say something full of wisdom, but no.
but because it's interesting, because John, you're working with a gigantic pit orchestra, and you're writing Antony and Cleopatra and all your other operas, knowing these massive resources are going to be in place for you. Michael, you're writing with a band, essentially. So between the two of you, what are the similarities and what are the differences in that?
You want to start?
Well, I've been an orchestra composer for as long as I've been a composer, and I love the repertoire. So that's basically the way I speak. I mean, I write string quartets and other things, but that's basically my métier. And, you know, I love the great works, whether, you know, it's Mozart or Wagner or Verdi or Debussy, Mussorgsky, those operas, and the way that the orchestra sort of carries especially with Wagner, it's kind of the real psychological event is really happening in the orchestra. I mean, sometimes I was at Mark Twain said, I really love those Wagner operas, if it only weren't for the singers. You know, I mean, I did write a show once. I wrote a show with like 20 pop songs and worked in a small scale, 8 instruments. And I love doing it, and frankly, if I ever write another theater piece, I'm going to do something like what you're doing. Yeah, yeah. It's a lot fewer notes.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, well, I think we have the grass is always greener, because I'm always like, oh my goodness, like when can we do the full orchestra concert of these shows? You know, I came from the orchestra world as well, so I love that sound. I think there is, I will say, the one thing that I've learned to fall in love with the smaller Broadway-sized orchestra is that you have to get so creative with how to get things to happen and how to get things to be effective, because you're working with such a small ensemble. And I think it's made me a way better composer, because what happens is that it forces you to think about, like, what are the absolute bare minimum of things that need to happen to make this moment effective? And I think, you know, I'm 38, so I've only been doing this professionally for about 20 years. And I think it's a great place to start, actually, because I would love to become more involved in the orchestra world and have written some symphonic pieces and concertos and stuff. But I would love to get there more one day. And I think that this starting in theater has actually made me able to maybe one day aspire to being able to write better for a bigger ensemble, because again, it's just about what are the fundamental ideas that like need to happen. You know, to even elaborate just a little bit more, like one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is like, maybe there's only like 3 or 4 things that can actually be happening simultaneously in like good music. You know, it's like, I love Bach, huge fan of Bach. He's almost sort of like, maybe this is a weird analogy, but he's kind of like the Shakespeare of music, you know, in a way that he just made something so fundamentally successful, like just on like a foundational level, you know. And it's like with his music, it's like he was so brilliant with counterpoint. You know, even in the most complicated moments, it's usually sometimes it's just 2 voices, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4, maybe sometimes it's more than that. But there's not a million ideas happening at once. It's that each idea is so strong and so effective, you know? And then from there, it's like, if you have more pieces, you can expand that and make it more colorful and make it more interesting. But getting down to that distilled essence.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's standard, Michael, in your world, but kind of unusual in John's world, is that you're both composers who use amplification. And John, you've had the collaboration with Mark Gray as a sound designer going back decades now. John, could you say something about why amplification has been important in your own music and in an opera house where it's still pretty unusual to have an amplified opera?
Well, there were two reasons. One is that I don't really like standard style of operatic singing. I never did. I think in the time of Monteverdi or Mozart, there were small spaces where people performed, in some duke's court. Starting with Wagner, the stage got bigger and the orchestra got bigger and the orchestra got louder and singers started hooting. And I never liked it, but I was always drawn to opera. I liked the form. So, and I also like American style of singing because I grew up listening to, Ella Fitzgerald and Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan. And so I wanted my singers to be amplified. It's a difficult word because immediately people think of the most horrible experience, like a bad Broadway show where the sound is drilling your eardrum. But I knew, even as far back as the premiere of Nixon in China, which was 1987, I knew that this would eventually, the technology would get better and better. And it has become. And the second thing was that I cared deeply about the text being audible. And I once read a quote from Richard Strauss, who is a master of the loud orchestra. And he said, well, my goal is that the audience will understand 20% of what's being sung. And I wanted 100%. So that was it. But it was very controversial. I remember Mark Gray, you mentioned, my wonderful sound designer, and at San Francisco, I think it was the premiere of Dr. Atomic, and he had his mixing board right in the back, the back seat, very last seats of the house, and Anthony Tomasini, who was the classical music critic of the New York Times, came in, and I happened to be standing with Mark, and he looked at the mixing board, and then he just shook his head.
Michael, do you find it envious or odd when you see somebody else's work and it's completely outside the amplified acoustic zone?
No, I love it. I love it. I love acoustic music, and I think, I think it's about like having your cake and eating it too. Like, and to your point, like we're there with technology now because you want the clarity. You want to be able to. I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's like the story comes from the words in so many ways, especially in a musical. And so you want everybody to be able to hear everything, and at the same time. You want certain moments to be loud. You don't want everything to be loud, but there's moments where you want things to really be elevated, And so I don't find either strange. I think the goal is that it sounds good and that the music is effective, right? So I think any way you get there is fantastic.
It's like the Duke Ellington line, if it sounds good, it is good.
Yeah, amen, yeah.
In your three different realms, because Chuck, you mentioned throwing the tape against the wall, and Sisbury doing that and saying, never listen to somebody else's voice. In your three different realms, how do you relate to the people who came before us? And what I'm getting at is, John, is something that I read it about Antony and Cleopatra, that you, and I thought this was very wise, that you said you made the decision to not hear Samuel Barber's opera, completely stay away from it, and that would allow you to just write your work without prior influences. And just as Verdi's Otello has nothing to do with Rossini's Otello, except they're both Italian operas. And at the same time, people are always building up from what came before. So in all three realms, I'm just wondering, where do you need to understand what came before, or where do you just need to break away? Chuck, let's start with you.
I would say it's both. There's a pub in Stratford-upon-Avon called the Dirty Duck, if anyone has gone there. It is the pub. You've been there many times. And on it are the pictures of everyone, Olivier, Gielgud, whatever. One of my heroes of all time as an actor is Richard Burton. I've always just been drawn to him. And I remember Richard Burton's picture was up there. I remember my first season at the RSC, which was 2000, so before we worked there, thinking, wow, that wall, there they all are. Those are the guys. That's what we're breathing. This is the pub they hung out in, And then fast forward, if you go there now, next to Richard Burton's picture is mine, right? Because I did so much there, right? So, absolutely, when I did Hamlet here, I broke my cardinal rule, which shows that I also agree with not seeing anything. Like, if I'm playing a role, I never go back to watch what someone else has ever done. I just don't. I don't believe in that. It gets in my way. It's going to be in my head, But for some reason, because of Richard Burton, I was like, I just can't see him as Hamlet. I need to go watch it. So I watched his Hamlet. And I remember thinking, I never knew he was so dynamic. He never stopped moving. Never stopped moving. The language was in his body. So I didn't take his Hamlet. I didn't take his delivery. But that idea of never stopping moving, my hero did that. So I'm going to do that in my own way, right? So I believe it's a combination of two things. I never go to watch things to say, this is how I'm going to do it. But as much as I can tap into the essence, as much as these words that attach themselves to the guys before, spontaneity of Olivier, diction of Gielgud, whatever that's there, you've heard that your whole life growing. So those are the things that are good. So find them within yourself, right? Without copying them. And that's how I sort of sit on that trajectory.
I agree with that so much. I think for me it's when I get stuck. I don't really check out what other people did for certain things until I get stuck. So like an example would be, like in musical theater, we have a thing called like an 11 o'clock number, which is like a big Act 2 song from your lead character that kind of like is the emotional pinnacle of the show, right? And we have a really big one in Goddess. It's called Nadira's aria. The lead character is Nadira. And it was just so daunting because it's just like you're going to take, 4 or 5, 10 minutes of an audience's time at like the most critical moment of the show. And it's really intimidating. And so that was a moment where I didn't really know where to begin when I first started writing the show. And so I was like, okay, this is a moment where I need to check in with like what other people have done. And so then did a deep dive into like all of the most successful 11 o'clock numbers. And then from there, I would agree with you completely, where it's like I don't take anything from those, but it's like a spirit that you have to learn how to tap into. And you find this like, it's just like an energy of like, how do these all work, And then you try to use your own vocabulary to tap into that spirit.
John.
Well, you're right. In the case of Antony and Cleopatra, I knew that the Samuel Barber opera was a hot potato. That it was a really big, lavish production, and that it was very controversial. A lot of people didn't like it, and I really respect Samuel Barber and some of his pieces I love, and conduct, but I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to read the libretto for obvious reasons. On the other hand, you know, I'm also an orchestra conductor, and when I'm doing a Sibelius symphony or a Stravinsky piece or Debussy, I listen to a lot of recordings. I want to hear what other conductors have done, and I will be inspired by maybe 3 bars by Leonard Bernstein and 3 bars by Simon Rattle, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I'm also interested, I love to listen to really old recordings from the 1920s or 30s and see how music has changed. So, in that sense, you want to do the research.
It occurred to me, especially since we're sitting in the Ansbacher at the Public Theater, and the legacy of Joe Papp, and you know, a theater built and conceived for everybody, that there's a circumstantial overlap between Barber's Antony and Cleopatra and John Adams' Antony and Cleopatra, and that both were written for extraordinary black sopranos. And whatever worked or didn't work in the Barber, and I'm actually old enough to have seen it way back when in 1966. But the concept of the production, not the score, but the production, in it being for Leontine Price and Justino Diaz as Antony and Alvin Ailey choreographing, it was whatever actually happened, it was intended as a statement about cultural inclusion in opera in America at the time of the Civil Rights era, and at a time when on the Met roster and opera in general, a group of extraordinary black women were really dominating international opera in so many ways. And Antony and Cleopatra, as the opening production of the new Metropolitan Opera House, was a part of that. So thinking what we're going through in America today, the space in which we're sitting right now, I just can't help but ask how, both in the play of Antony and Cleopatra and in the opera, you know, are there undercurrents of race in the text and the theme that emerge or are in the background at different points?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and we did talk a great deal about it. And Elkanah and our wonderful dramaturg, Lucia Schechner, they got this very interesting idea that Americans became aware of Cleopatra through the movies. And it was, you know, it was 1930s Cleopatra, and of course, because it was Hollywood, it was a white woman. And then I don't know when the very first black actress, I know, is it Janice Sussman? Is that her name? Janice Sussman. Janice Sussman, who was South African, but she was not black. She was not black. So she, you could see her on old YouTubes. You know, she was lightly made up. Yeah. And we knew, of course, that the historic Cleopatra was a Ptolemy, so she was Macedonian and probably, by our standards, white. You know, for me, I didn't really care that much because I felt, you know, what we're dealing with as human beings. And I was aware that this woman is fighting to keep her civilization. And this story, among other things, not only is it a love story, but it is a political story because it's the decline of one civilization and the rise of another. So that was kind of the concern that we had. With that said, you know, we ended up with a cast that I think is 50-50. Our Enobarbus is Alfred Walker, who's just a terrific black baritone, and as you say, Julia, and also Charmian is black, and you know, especially these days when National Endowment is being killed and all these horrible, horrible things happening in the country, I'm sort of proud of it. You know, I think this is one thing we can do in the arts is just make this bold statement about that you know, we're all human beings.
We are all human beings, and it's a bold statement, and we've also reached 8 p.m. So I want to thank Michael Thurber and Chukwudi Iwuji and John Adams so much, and thank all of you for being here tonight.